Representative Raybould, you're back. How are you?
I'm great, Matt. It's good to see you on a Monday.
On a Monday, man, I botched that. Anyway, I am very happy that you're here. We had a great conversation. It was last week, right?
Last week.
And we were talking specifically about people threatening elected officials and how damaging that is. And again, the culture around threats and violence and things like that. But we didn't have a ton of time, and you let off as you were leaving. You're like, well, I'm actually doing this other, like, I really care about this other problem. I was like, oh, what's the problem? And you're saying essentially prostitution and human trafficking as they relate. And I love that you're taking up the charge in this. I live near Eagle. I don't live in Eagle, but I live near Eagle, and Eagle just had a, sex trafficking prostitution bust where they had a massage parlor that was essentially human trafficking people and having them in the sex trade. And there may have been some voluntary engagement from locals. I'm not 100% sure, but I know for sure there were people that were not there under their own free will that were being forced to engage in these things. And it's unconscionable. It's just unthinkable. As it stands right now in the state of Idaho, if you're a John, so you're a customer going to engage in this, the first infraction is a misdemeanor. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, that's correct. Under the existing law.
Under the existing law. And that's a misdemeanor, whether it's two consenting adults or somebody who's being human trafficked and then like somebody coming to purchase. It doesn't matter. The law doesn't view that differently. And then the second infraction is a felony. So they step up. You're advocating to convert to remove the initial misdemeanor infraction and just say, look, if you are going to solicit commercial sex from somebody, be them a trafficked person or a just consenting adult, either way, we are going to crush the demand on this. We're going to make the first infraction a felony. We will hopefully drive down the market for this, which in turn will drive down the value of human trafficking, the frequency of human trafficking, and ultimately reduce human suffering overall. Talk to me about this.
So last summer, someone sent me, I think it was a TikTok or an Instagram reel, and it was a discussion between two guys that were talking about the fact that in Texas they had made a similar move where they had removed the misdemeanor charge for paying for commercial sex, and I thought, well, surely Idaho doesn't have that on the books. It's Idaho. It must just be a felony in Idaho, and so as I started digging into the code and saw that no, in fact, we too had an initial charge of a misdemeanor on that first offense and then a felony after that, I thought, well, wait a minute. Do we or do we not think this is something that we should stand opposed to, at least as far as our social values are concerned? And when you take it into the context, all of the work that has been done in the state recently, as it relates to human trafficking and how we've updated our laws to reflect care and attention for those who are the victims of it and to focus on those who are contributing to it and are basically harming these individuals, it seemed to me like a pretty easy answer that we should follow in Texas's footsteps on this one, and that we need to show that we treat this crime with the seriousness that it deserves, which is as a felony. And so as I started diving into it and looking around, the easiest solution was to just say, no more misdemeanor going forward. You will receive a felony charge if you are caught in the process of paying for sex.
I cannot disagree with you, right? Like, it's a terrible thing. And the concern I have heard expressed about this from law enforcement agents, because I've never been in law enforcement. I don't know prosecuting or frequency or problems with this at all. Some of the things they've said are, look, it's not cut and dry always what's happening. It's not always also cut and dry if people knew what they were engaging in or not. And again, that's coming from them. I don't know anything about it. But how would we navigate that? For instance, there are many dating sites. And some dating sites are geared towards people who are really just more interested in like a hookup culture. And it's my understanding that on those hookup culture dating sites, the people that are offering prostitution as a service, be it, a pimp for somebody being trafficked or an individual that's just offering themselves, you have a much higher propensity of finding those people on the hookup sites, but you also have people that are genuinely just there to hook up with other people. They're interested in, low engagement, intercourse. So how do we flush that out with, like, is it possible that somebody could stumble into a situation accidentally? Are there more robust, checks and balances or a heavier burden of proof?
I think we need to distinguish between the person who is engaging in a let's just say a one-off relationship, to your point. They cross paths with someone on a dating app. They end up in a situation where they're meeting for an evening. And that's essentially kind of the extent of it. Now, whether money changes hands or not, that's a different piece of the discussion. Where I really think there's an opportunity for us to have an impact is on those who are essentially the serial purchasers. The data makes a very compelling argument. Out of all men, roughly 20% of them will purchase a sex act at some point in their life. 80% won't even go near it, right? And within that 20%, you have roughly 72% of that number that are your high users, so are purchasing more than 6 times per year. So to your point, the examples that you're talking about, that's not this individual. There is certain behaviors, there are certain attitudes that exist within someone who is a repeat purchaser of sex. And when you look at the data from that perspective, when you look at how do you potentially decrease the likelihood that this individual is going to continue to repeat that behavior, you can't ignore the potential impact of them looking at it and going, hey, it's not just a possibility that if I haven't been caught up till now, that I could get a misdemeanor. If I get caught at this point, it's going to be a felony, right? You know, for these repeat individuals, we've essentially lowered the potential risk for them if they have not been caught up to this point. But now, should this bill move forward and go into effect, we've essentially raised the threshold. And the part for me that has really sort of stuck out is that when we talk about human trafficking, the overwhelming majority of individuals who are brought in, you know, from other countries and are trafficked, it's for sex. I mean, there are some that are, you know, it's related to work and to some other activities, but it's sex. And so if I'm trying to drive down some of that demand, if I'm trying to make it less appealing for someone to want to traffic in another human being, I got to start looking at ways to decrease the likelihood that someone is going to want to be a buyer of that trafficked individual. And one of the ways for that to happen is by increasing the penalty associated with it. In fact, this is a provision that was recommended in the Attorney General's report on human trafficking from back in 2023. Now, it didn't make the cut when they were making their original changes and updating the laws during the last legislative session, but this was a component. By increasing the potential punishment that is, you know, available as a result of someone engaging in this activity, we do have some sense that it will have an impact on behavior if people perceive that there is a greater risk to themselves when they're engaging in it.
A question for you, and again, that makes perfect sense. Somebody articulated to me there is a bill. In reality, there is a bill that is designed to increase the punishment for child predation and like assaulting a 10-year-old or something to a capital punishment. And in reviewing that, I did hear from somebody that they're like, okay, that's all well and fine, but, and again, like, fine, like let's give them the worst punishment possible, fine. But you have to look at the unintended consequences of a bill like that. I'm like, well, how do you mean? And he explained, look, if you have a crime that's already bad, and you know if you're the one committing the crime, you can't let anybody find out, and you know that the risk is now that you're going to get killed, how do you engage the only person that's actually going to be able to rat on you, tattle on you, which is like the child? There's the victim. The victim. Yeah. Now, if the victim is the only one that can help identify you as the perpetrator, if you go away for a certain amount of time, then, you treat them in a certain manner. But if you know that if they expose you, that you'll be put to death, you take different steps. A portion of those people will likely not engage in that horrible, horrendous behavior. But another portion of those people may still engage in it. And now they realize that as long as that kid's walking around, they have, the death penalty on their head if they get exposed. And what he was saying is that could lead to, victims of sexual violence actually getting killed by the perpetrator. Do you see any of those unintended consequences bleeding out in a bill like this? And again, I don't have any, like, right off the top of my head. I'm genuinely wondering, like, are there any concerns where it's like, if we make it worse, they might make it worse for the prostitute or the trafficked person?
So there was a criminal defense attorney who came and was who testified as part of the committee hearing process, and she raised many, not exactly the same, but kind of along the same vein of unintended consequences.
So I didn't miss this entirely.
No.
Fantastic.
You are definitely in the ballpark of weighing the trade-offs of what you have to consider when you're proposing a policy change. And in this instance, she put out there the possibility that this risks exposing women to potential abuse or increased harm, or placing them in even more difficult situations than they otherwise would be because of the potential fear on the part of the man who is paying for services at that fear of exposure. And the thing that I'm looking at is you are asking someone who is a victim, right? No one wakes up, when they go to high school and career day and is asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? No one says sex worker. And so we're looking at the situation and we're saying, well, the potential risk to this individual if they find themselves in this situation, I'm kind of like, aren't we potentially lowering the risk to them if we've increased the risk of someone buying services to the point where they think twice about whether or not they should even be buying the service? Because if we're talking about getting into the scenario of, okay, they've purchased the service, they are now concerned about the possibility of getting caught, and does that increase the risk to the woman who is on the other side of that transaction? I think we have to have an awareness of that, but I also think the threshold should be high enough that the person who's even considering buying the service should be thinking twice. And if making them weigh the possibility of a felony is potentially enough to make them think, maybe not this time, to me, that's one more or one less opportunity for someone else to be victimized than they otherwise would be. I think if I'm looking at this sort of like big picture, if we're talking about what we value as a community, what we value as a state, we want to have a higher priority to be on an individual who finds themselves in a situation that they're being asked to do something they don't want to do. And so my concern is about them, and part of helping to alleviate some of the trauma and some of the pain and some of the challenges that they're facing means that we can't excuse the behavior of the other. We can't excuse or look away from the fact that, this system has existed for eons, right? I mean, we're talking about a process that's been in place, I think, for as long as there's been humans. And for me, I look at it and go, what are our alternatives? And what was frustrating for me to hear is the criminal defense attorney basically argued for decriminalization. I mean, she didn't say that, but she essentially talked in terms of, well, we should just take away the stigma, because then the individuals who were involved, be it the man or the woman, can report up, whether it's the pimps or the traffickers or whoever, and we create this safe space for them to be. And it's like, well, you're arguing for decriminalizing paying for sex. And if that's the flip side, if that's the alternative, I don't think that's where we want to go either. So what's left for those of us who are trying to figure out policy is to essentially say, can we raise the threshold to a point where the person who is considering perpetuating the crime pauses and goes, you know what, that risk level is too high for me. I can't afford the potential risk of what would come if I were to get caught and then be charged with a felony.
When you talk about the percentages, and again, makes sense. And I totally get that it's like, hey, let's kill the market, or let's hamper the market. The more we can do that, the fewer people will be victimized. The worse or less victimization that people existing in it right now will experience the whole thing. When you talk about 72% of the men that engage in paying for sex over their lifetime, you said, look, 80% won't do it ever. 20% will. And of that 20%, 72% of those people are going to be doing it multiple times a year.
Yeah.
So we essentially have like 14% of the males in the community paying regularly for sex with people. And for them, they're probably very concerned about, if they know that it's not going to be a slap on the wrist, they're they're constantly doing a cost benefit analysis of like, do I engage in this or do I not? And if it gets bad enough for those people, I have to imagine that like people make rational decisions. People make one-off terrible decisions, right? Like essentially what I'm getting at is, I'm sure there's a percentage of people that are like, well, I mean, it seemed like a good idea at the time. That was a terrible idea. I'll never do that again. Or like, I don't know why I did that. Or you're at like a bachelor party or something. I don't know, whatever it might be. But people aren't making cost benefit analysis of their behavior. They're just taking this like one-off crazy decision. They're like, I can't believe I did that. Like, that's crazy, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But for the people that aren't doing that, that do it on a regular basis, they're weighing this cost benefit analysis, which is where the deterrent comes in, which is like, they're going to have to add in this horrendous result if they get caught. And I have to imagine for the people that are thinking intelligently about this, that your deterrent will have the max effect on them. And that's the majority of people engaging this. If you said, look, the only people that are really thinking about this, it's like, of 100% of the men that engage in this, it's only like 5% are repeat offenders. For the other ones, they're not thinking. Yeah. They get,
it's a one-off.
It's a one-off. They're like a strip club, or they make some terrible, I don't know where they are. They make some bad decision. It's a one-off, but that's not the case. The majority of people, it sounds like, are people that are very regularly like, do I want to do this today or do I not? Like, shall I call the person or shall I not? Like, again, engaging in thoughtful appraisal of their intended action. So I have to imagine that this deterrent would work really well for them.
Well, when you think about the fact that the men who are engaged in this behavior on a repeat basis, and when I say repeat, weekly, monthly, they make up roughly 75% of all the transactions and the amount of money that's spent. And we are talking about a market that, values into the billions. Again, this is not intended to trip up somebody who finds themselves in an unexpected situation. That's not what this is about. This is really intended to draw attention to the fact that the individuals who are driving a lot of the victimization, who are sort of the prime audience for the human traffickers, who are moving women for the purposes of getting them to do sex work, it is for these individuals who are engaging in this repeat behavior. It is not for the guy who is,
the one-off
sliding, sliding right or left on a dating app. That's not who this is about. And if you're talking about sort of the total volume perspective, I don't know how else you get to someone who is engaged in that kind of repeat behavior unless it's a serious consequence for that repeat behavior. And I had heard that, well, okay, if someone's engaging in repeat behavior, well, then isn't it enough that, the misdemeanor happens, and then if they do it again, it's
Sure.
a felony at that point. And I said, well, every conversation I've had, be it with law enforcement or the prosecutors, is that this is a really difficult crime from the standpoint of how many different things you kind of have to have line up. The conditions, who will make statements, who won't make statements. And there's just a bunch of different pieces that have to fall into place to the point where sometimes it can be really difficult for those charges to stick. And if I'm looking at that scenario and I'm in a situation where I potentially have all of the pieces on the board that would allow that crime to go forward, do I gamble that on the second go around for that felony, that I'm still going to have all the pieces on the board, even though I've got a pretty good idea that that individual has engaged in the behavior for which, I'm looking at him for?
The burden of proof is just so great. You're like, oh, we're going to roll the dice that we'll get him again.
And so again, it kind of comes back to you. If the intention is to undercut the behavior of the repeat, of the person who's going out and is continually engaging and purchasing sex, I don't see another avenue available to potentially make them pay attention other than to say from the get-go, we are going to charge this crime with the level of seriousness that it deserves because you are victimizing another human. You just are. And if there are those who worry about sort of like the inadvertent examples, that we talked about earlier, I can appreciate that. But at the same time, I also think we need to take responsibility for our actions. And if we're engaging in behavior that puts us in a position where we are engaging in behavior that causes harm to someone else in that fashion, I think we should treat it with the seriousness that it deserves.
Yeah. Is there a mechanism in this to make that distinction? Say you have the person who's like just stops thinking for a minute. And poo-poo on them. Like, that's a terrible thing to stop thinking about. Like, I'm not defending it in the least. But again, the capturing the person who's not the repeat offender, is there a mechanism here or a distinction of some sort where it's like, okay, this person did make a really, really bad mistake, but this is like the first time and the only time most likely this person would engage in that. Is there a mechanism to work with that person, or is it essentially like, no. If you get caught in our net, you're in the net.
Well, what I was really careful with is I didn't put any mandatory minimum with this. So there is still discretion when it comes to the sentencing as far as the judge is concerned. And ultimately, it is up to the prosecutor as to what they did, what they proceed to charge with. Right? This is not a requirement of if A happens, then you are automatically charged with X. That is not the scenario that this legislation envisions. Instead, it essentially says that should the evidence demonstrate that you have committed this act and that you have done so under the way we've defined it within Idaho code, you will be charged with a felony. And then the potential punishment of that is up to 5 years in jail and then an associated fine. The reality is that I don't want us to stop seeing the individuals who are engaging this behavior as individuals, right? I don't want to paint them with the brush of, oh, you're a bad human. You do this thing that we don't approve of or that we don't agree with, and that makes you, irredeemable. That's not it at all. It's essentially a signal that we take this so serious and that we take what it can potentially do to our communities in a way that we want to elevate it. We want to almost elevate the discussion to be about, we think this is so important for how we talk about this, how we treat this, that everybody has the opportunity to understand that if you engage in this behavior, there is a punishment that we believe essentially fits the crime, that fits the seriousness of the crime. And in this instance, we're talking about one human deciding that another human should provide them with sex in exchange for some sort of, funds or other services or whatever it might be. And I'm pretty comfortable in saying I don't agree with that in any way, shape, or form. And as a result of that, I think we need to establish that that's where we stand and that it's in line with all of the efforts that we've been pursuing related to human trafficking, knowing that that's one of the primary objectives of traffickers is to put these individuals into sex work because it's lucrative. I mean, again, we're talking about billions of dollars a year. They're not doing this for chump change. They're doing it because it's leading to a meaningful source of illegal funds for them to continue doing what they're doing. And we have an obligation to do on the other side of things, not just go after the traffickers, but those who would use the services that are being provided through those trafficking networks.
You make a lot of sense. You make a lot of sense. And knowing that there's that discretion involved, which is the prosecutor can weigh all of the details and be like, all right, look, we're going to go for the full felony. We're going to go. But again, there is that, I don't want to say wiggle room, but people will be able to determine what's appropriate.
Well, the prosecutor is ultimately going to have to make the call. Do I have the evidence for this case to stand up in court? Because the same rules apply for this charge as they do for any other criminal charge in the state. The prosecutor is going to have to go in and make an argument to a judge and a jury and is going to have to establish that not only is the evidence there, but that the evidence provides beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual is guilty. And that's the other thing I want to make clear too. I do not assume that simply because someone has been charged that they are guilty. Because to your point, there may be circumstances where someone gets caught, where law enforcement potentially comes down into a situation where there's a large group of women who are being trafficked and someone may be there for totally, innocuous reasons, right? And in the initial sweep up, they get caught. But the evidence will show whether or not they were engaged in intentional behavior that puts them at risk of having run afoul of this particular law. And I think that's the aspect too that I want to reinforce. I am not looking to victimize the women who find themselves in this difficult position. And your audience may hear me making reference to like men and to women. Men are overwhelmingly the individuals who are purchasing sex, and it's with women, right? So it's not that others don't find themselves being victimized on either side of that particular biological coin. It's just overwhelmingly it's men, right. And so when I look at the scenario, I look at what do I feel like is within our power to do. Our power as policymakers is to set the threshold of saying we believe this crime is serious enough that it deserves consideration as a felony from the get-go.
Representative Raybould, I appreciate you. I appreciate this. Again, I'm not a law enforcement agent, but I do very much appreciate the idea that we could kill a market or decrease it. Again, like Eagle just had a human trafficking bust where there were these people being forced into sex trafficking against their will. That's unconscionable. So
Yeah, and I just found out this afternoon, quite literally, that there are some raids that had happened over in Bonneville County, of all places, related to similar setups. And I think one of the things that the world we live in now doesn't allow is for us to pretend that it's not happening nearby, right? This isn't something that's happening, in another state or even another city. It's happening near us,
Right here.
Yeah, it's right here, and again, this isn't about, trying to scare people or to gin up fear. It's just an acknowledgement that the world we live in can be complicated. And some of those complications requires us to take a hard look at how we do things today and how we maybe need to do them differently based on how things have changed.
When is this? You said it passed out of committee and it's going to a hearing? Or excuse me, it's going to the floor?
Yeah, it came out of committee last week. It's on the second reading calendar right now. So I would anticipate it would be up on the floor for a vote probably sometime later this week.
Awesome. Let's connect when it's over.
That would be great.
I'd love to hear what the feedback was. And again, I'm not from this world, right?
Yeah.
But I always like hearing what people come up with and understanding why it either passed and the law enforcement had concerns or they didn't have concerns or whatever it was. Let's all get on the same page and do something about it.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And like I said, I am not unaware that there are trade-offs like there is with any policy that you pursue. Sure. And I look at this as, I think in the way that I have weighed the trade-offs going into this, I believe long-term there are more potential benefits than there are negatives, but I am not going to pretend to anyone that there isn't the potential that there may be some negative consequences that come out as a result of this. But ultimately, I think we will do more good and will help more people who find themselves in just horrible conditions, that you may now have a way to escape something that you haven't had to previously because, frankly, there isn't someone coming along and demanding services that you would otherwise have to provide. And now there might just be an off-ramp for you to have a different life. And for me, that's worth it.
I love that. Let's follow up. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much.